I was going on about my uncle as I love to do. But I just, I kind of, I see him in that kind of a remarkable way in terms of the kind of musician that he was, because he was not genre bound.
Mm-hmm.
He was culturally bound.
Oh,
You know?
right.
Which is an important difference.
Yeah. I mean, look, he's and also just, I think, perhaps unbeknownst to many people, an incredible amount of musical work that he did. I mean, even if you're talking about those times, the 60s, so there's Grazing in the Grass. There's also a record called Africa 68.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the recordings had originally been done in New York before they came over to California, but they were finished off in California. There's also another record by the so-called Johannesburg Street Band called Dancing Through the Streets, which falsely implies that somehow this is a band from South Africa playing this music. Meantime, it's my uncle and the Crusaders and those cats. But like even that, because when you listen to Dancing Through the Streets, it could really be a contemporaneous 1960s South African township band. His ability to translate and transmit feeling to other musicians, I think, is second to none, certainly in those days. So there's Dancing Through the Streets. There's, he also played on some early Bob Marley tracks during that time.
Right, yeah.
Wow. I mean, this guy was everywhere all the time.
You must have attended a lot of his recording sessions. What of those sessions stand out? There must have been, I'm sure, several.
It's funny because as a kid growing up, this is what my family does. I never thought anything of it. So to be honest with you, most of the time when I'm in the studio, I'm just hanging out with my uncles and just listening to music being made. It doesn't, not to underplay it, but I expect this of them. I know that sounds crazy, but even, when I look back, I think that, what Miriam did and the kind of lane that I think Huey and Stuart Levine opened, I think to this day exists only because of a peculiar kind of chemistry and, again, an appreciation and a respect for roots. I mean, if I think about, because when I say opened a lane, when I think about popular music back in those days, even in the California scene, yes, it's kind of rock and roll, but it's like, mostly those guys like the Wrecking Crew and those guys, and it's a lot of session musicians, and there are a lot of rock and roll garage bands, but there's not a whole lot of jazz going on, and while, Kind of Blue and those records, In a Silent Way and Feel the Kilimanjaro, all those kind of records were out, and Ornette Coleman had kind of, freaked people out with his sound. Jazz wasn't popular music per se. And like the kind of music that the Crusaders made, the kind of, Joe Sample playing all kinds of crazy sessions from with the Jackson 5 to Joni Mitchell to whoever, to Steely Dan, and that whole kind of lane of Steely Dan-like bands that came up kind of in the early 70s kind of thing. I'm not saying that these guys invented the genre. Obviously not. But what I am saying is that that kind of musicality was not necessarily what was popular or thought of as being popularized. So Stewart doing like Randy Crawford's first album, Stewart doing Minnie Riperton's last record, Adventures in Paradise, all those Crusaders records past the plate, Crusaders 1, Old Socks, New Shoes, Old Socks, just that kind of music being out there. Yes, you had Sly Stone, but in between Sly Stone to say George Clinton, if I'm gonna kind of jump that space, Earth, Wind and Fire, okay, yeah, but Earth, Wind and Fire is also not till later, really. But in that space there, that kind of funky, dancey, poppy, but not necessarily a popular, like Green Onions by, like, there's not a lot of that music out there. And those guys occupy that lane in a way that, in the way that I see it. They kind of open up that lane and, so yeah, Al Jarreau and all that kind of music that comes through, which we love listening to, but was never mainstream. Al Jarreau never had a top 20 hit or anything like that. But that music made enough motion that record companies knew that they had to support George Benson, all those that they had to be behind it because it was music and it was music that people liked to listen to. And it wasn't as far as the kind of like Creed Taylor Impulse, because that's more jazz. Mm-hmm. It was, you wash dishes and listen to it.
One of the things that I've always been fascinated by is that Hugh developed a very special sound on the trumpet. It was described as a mixture of jazz and South African music, but to me it seemed more unique. Did he ever describe what that sound was?
He never, somewhere in the book there's he calls it township bala, whatever he calls it. But what I do know about his sound is that Huey always loved Clifford Brown. Mm-hmm. Like, obviously he liked Miles Davis, but he really dug Clifford Brown, his tone, his sound. So I think that was a part of it. Mm-hmm. And I think also what's unique to his sound is that, he did a lot of music with Caiphus Semenya, who I also count as one of my uncles. And so one day I was talking to my uncle Caiphus and I was talking about a particular song. I forgot what song it was. I think it was Caution, actually, which is on the Unionist of that. And so I said to him, hey, that sounds like somebody talking. And he said, actually, you're right. It's somebody speaking in Setswana. So I think that what it is about Huey's sound is that he's actually speaking South African languages through his horn in the way that he plays. And he's translating, there's a riff of his from his first record pretty much to the last, like he played that line and note in innumerable circumstances in many, situations. But I always hear that as sign, kind of like his call sign, if you will. That's his signature. This is me, guys. This is Hugh. And it's like a kind of like rhythmic, percussive kind of playing, mimicking language, how people talk, the different language, in South Africa, there are a lot, there's a level of official languages, but there's a whole bunch, how those languages, there's the Nguni group, but how those languages all sound have their own uniqueness to them. And Tshivenda has its own sound, and Tsonga has its own sound. And Huey, if he could not speak them all, was certainly familiar with every single South African language that there was.
Amazing. In spite of his success, he remained outspoken about apartheid. He also was vocal about other themes in his music. How did the American establishment and the press react to that? His outspokenness?
I think that Hugh's great power is that he got in with musicians, and he never had any kind of crazy relationship with journalists. You know, like when I think of the Rolling Stones, I think of Stanley Booth. If I think of rock and roll, I think of Lester Bangs. He never had those kind of relationships with journalists. He had relationship with musicians, and he had relationships that managed to get him to music executives. But he didn't really have a strong relationship with the press. I think that the American establishment, so after Grazing in the Grass, The Promise of a Future, he put out a record called Masekela, right? And it was a protest record, right? And the first song on the album is Mason Grenades. Mason Grenades, Jackass and Napalm Bombs, bazookas and machine guns going off all around me, right? Vietnam War. Another song on there called Riot. Instrumental, but it's still called Riot. Another instrumental called Fuzz. Not the nicest thing to call a cop in the 60s. But did that. You know, there's another song on that album called Gold, and I call it Stimela Part 1. Because Gold is about a miner, and it's like a spoken word kind of slam poetry vibe, but he's talking about, you know, how you my chief, how you making me dig, you leave the settlers to make me dig these stones, man. You know, and I've got $90 in my purse, and I'm, you know, and plenty of city clothes, and then, you know, and so it's like it's a view into a miner's life, which was impromptu success, by the way. Grazing in the Grass was not planned. They'd finished the record, they took it to the record company said record's too short. Saxophone player says, hey, da-da-da-da-da. They go, the other dude, boom, Grazing in the Grass, puts it on, 3 minutes, afterthought, boom. That's the song that everybody turns on to. Real, and that song is Makanga. That's like Makanga, straight up. So that record, Masekela, was when I think the establishment kicked him too. Besides the fact that he's friends with guys like David Crosby, right? Who's going out on stage saying, the American public should be aware that your government killed your president right before your eyes, right? So these are my friends. So he wasn't like, you know, well loved by the establishment. The thing that always blew my mind about Hugh is that he made records. He made records. No matter what happened, I could be rest assured that at least in a year, my uncle's gonna put out a record, whatever's going on in the world. And that ability to find his way into the studio and to get record companies to willingly put out those records. Because after Masekela, he does an album called Reconstruction. A lot of Reconstruction is with Uncle Caiaphas is there, Uncle Jonas is on there somewhere, Uncle Philly's on there. And it's a crazy record because it's got these really, you know, popish, stringy songs like Father Time, Both Sides Now, Traces, and it's got this really like, you know, Salemane and Waza and Make Me a Potion. It's also got these very like vibrant African, very African sounding songs. So it's a really crazy record. Then they did Hugh Masekela in the Union of South Africa, which was largely supported by the Crusaders. uh, my uncle Caiaphas was telling me about Joe, because so it's Joe Sample, Styx Hooper, and Wilton Felder on bass, which a lot of people don't know that he was a really great bass player.
And then turned saxophonist.
And that. So that's the band. And so I forgot what song it was. And so Joe Sample says to, I hope you don't mind me cursing just a little bit. Joe Sample, so Joe Sample says to my Uncle Caiaphas, he says, man, you just show me where the one is and I'll play the shit out of this music. So, Union of South Africa, and then after Union of South Africa, he does an album called Home is Where the Music Is. Home is Where the Music is probably the most jazz he had been up to that point in terms of his sound. They recorded it in London. It's Hugh Masekela, Larry Willis on piano, Eddie Gomez on bass, Dudu Pukwana on saxophone, and Nchoko, that's his surname, I forget his first name, on drums. Just as almost like a township jazz band. And they play all these traditional South African songs. It's a double album, and the cover art is by Dumile Feni, who was also a very well-known South African artist. So, yeah, he puts out these records. Like, he's done this thing. He's been, they came and they busted us. I was there on that night and they put us all in jail, and the women came and got me and left them in jail. Went through all this stuff, and he was still putting out these records. Like, I'm Hugh Masekela. This is the music I play. Hi, guys. Here's another album.